On today's World Insight with Tian Wei, the weeks-long suspension of the British Parliament, what does it mean for British democracy at a critical time? And trade tensions put a damper on Chinese looking to study in the US, the consequences of a throttled academic exchange? And here's our host, Tian Wei.
Hello and welcome to World Insight, coming to you live from Beijing on CGTN. We begin today's show in the UK, where Prime Minister Boris Johnson's decision to suspend Parliament 5 weeks from September to October got the go-ahead from Queen Elizabeth just 2 weeks before the UK is set to leave the European Union. The new Prime Minister's decision had a backlash among MPs and campaigners. Before we get down to a discussion about what's the real nature of this decision, take a look at this first.
The British Parliament on a 5-week suspension during a crucial time for Brexit. The Queen approved Prime Minister Boris Johnson's request to suspend Parliament from September 9th until October 14th. Johnson claimed it was necessary to allow him to pursue a new domestic agenda. He denied he was trying to prevent Parliament from obstructing his Brexit plans.
That is completely untrue. If you look at what we're doing, we're bringing forward a new legislative programme on crime, on hospitals, making sure that we have the education funding that we need. And there will be ample time on both sides of that crucial October the 17th summit, ample time in Parliament for MPs to debate the EU, to debate Brexit and all the other issues. Ample time.
But the 5-week-long suspension does not give lawmakers much time at all to pass legislation to avoid crashing out of the European Union on October 31st. Many MPs are calling the move a constitutional outrage, as they feel that a no-deal departure may be pushed through when they're being sidelined. Over 1.5 million people have signed a petition demanding the suspension be stopped. Protesters also gathered in numbers in front of Westminster. The new Prime Minister just won the leadership of the UK's governing Conservatives in June, following Theresa May's decision to resign after failing to get her Brexit deal through Parliament. He vowed to get Brexit done by the deadline when he won the election, and promised to work on widespread disillusionment over the protracted Brexit process, which was widely praised by his supporters. But this time, many wonder if he went too far in shaking the British political system. And what does it mean for Western democracy?
UK Parliament suspension for better or for worse? What's the decision coming from the UK? We have in London Professor Ian Begg from Institute, who is European Institute rather, also the co-director of the Durrandor Forum London School of Economics and Political Science. In Durham, we have Tom Brooks, Dean and Professor of Law and Government, Durham University. Joining us in Brussels, Nicholas White, Senior Director at APCO's Brussels office, last but not least in Beijing. Cui Hongjian, Director of the European Department from the China Institute of International Studies. Gentlemen, welcome to our program. Professor Begg, what's the real nature of this decision proposed by the Prime Minister, eventually approved by the Queen?
Well, you can read it two ways. One is that in the British system, it is normal for a parliamentary session to last a year. The current one has lasted over 2 years because it's been stalled by having to try to pass the Brexit legislation. So in one sense, it's not abnormal for a new Prime Minister to say, now we need a new legislative programme. That's why I end the current session and launch a new one with a new Queen's speech. But there's no doubt that the reason Boris has done this is to make it more difficult for his opponents in Parliament to oppose his Brexit plans. And what this really points to is a clash between two visions of democracy. Parliamentary democracy, which Parliament, as you can see behind me, is trying to support, and direct democracy coming from the referendum result, which Boris believes that he is duty-bound to deliver. Both are democracy, but they are both different interpretations of democracy.
Let me go to you, Professor Brooks, also about the same question. We see the Prime Minister, since coming into the office, has been very affirmative about what he wants to do. And this is an extension of apparently the actions and the rhetorics. But this is probably, some argue, more than the earlier ones, given the division of labor and also division of power of the so-called British democracy.
Yes, well, I think that he certainly has a sense of direction, but he's also, the Prime Minister is very good at saying one thing and then very quickly doing something very different. So, for example, when Boris Johnson won only a few weeks ago the leadership of the Conservative Party and became Prime Minister, he wrote to all Tory members saying that he was not going to prorogue Parliament, that he respected democracy as Prime Minister, and that he was going to try to win consensus among MPs for his plans. A few weeks later, he gets into number 10 Downing Street, and what does he do? He suspends Parliament. He does exactly what he told the Tory members who voted for him. He did what he said he was not going to do, and suspending Parliament and the mess that we are finding right now. So he has a bit of a, yes, he's kind of clear about his direction, but what direction he's going in can change from one moment to the next. And there's, an inconsistency, in Boris Johnson's pronouncements. This is not the first time.
Yeah, we've seen some patterns, Mr. White, if I can invite also your wisdom here. In some of the Western democracies, one example is in the United States, President Trump tried to use the utmost power of the executive branch, including even emergency acts, or taking advantage of crisis time to boost his own ultimate power. Now, are we going to seeing somewhat similar patterns also in the UK going on right now, given the latest development?
In times of crisis, constitutional structures are tested, and of course, if they are carefully crafted, they will tend to pass these tests. The United Kingdom is unusual among Western democracies in that its constitutional legislation is not actually written down in a single document. Of course, makes it more difficult. But I think the real test for the United Kingdom is coming not directly from the prorogation of Parliament, but from the threat to the continued membership in the UK of Northern Ireland and of Scotland. We're seeing the desires for independence in Scotland growing as a result of the whole Brexit phenomenon. We're seeing the likelihood of Northern Ireland voting to join the Republic of Ireland increasing as a result of the Brexit phenomenon. And I think the perception that the Prime Minister cannot be trusted to play fair with his own constitutional procedures and precedents, that's really not going to help the argument that from people who would like to keep the United Kingdom together in the future.
Several important buttons already been pushed. One is about the power of the president, prime minister rather, in this case in the UK, given its division of power within your system. Secondly, of course, is about some of the important areas in its nature of relation with the UK eventually at the end of the day. That's going to be a test of the system as well. Thirdly, of course, is the so-called trustworthy or not, the Prime Minister or other important figures of the UK political system, and what's that having on the impact of the system itself. Professor Begg, let me come back to you just to clarify for all our viewers all over the world, what exactly is the system inside your country, the UK, that the Prime Minister proposed something like suspending the Parliament, and the Queen has to approve that. But in this process, will the Queen, as an important figure still in the politics, be able to scrutinize the proposal, or it is just one of those procedures that a proposal needs to go through before it gets final approval? Professor Begg, do we still have, in a way, an interesting twist over there, or not anymore?
Look, the Queen is the head of state, so her equivalent in the United States is Donald Trump. But the Queen is not an executive. She is a constitutional monarch, and her actions in the political system are governed by conventions, as has just been explained by Mr. White. And the convention is that if her Prime Minister advises something like calling an election or suspending Parliament, or ending a session of Parliament, which is what this is really about. The word suspension sounds much more sinister than it really is in this context. Normally she's expected to do exactly that. And it's worth pointing out that the Queen is now on her 14th Prime Minister, having been in power for what by next summer will be 25,000 days. She's always kept in the background. She's not been overtly political. So the convention that she's following is exactly the one that she's been following in all her time in Buckingham Palace, and exactly what her father did before her. So it is the principle of a constitutional monarchy that the monarch does not engage in politics. And that puts enormous power on the Prime Minister, who uses this expression royal prerogative to do what he or she, the Prime Minister, wants to do. And that's very often very powerful, because the Prime Minister in the British system has a pivotal role, a huge power of patronage, which enables that person to make cabinet appointments, to suspend Parliament in the way we're now observing it, and so on.
Professor Brooks, as a law professor, may I also ask you a question regarding your expertise, which is, even given the decision made by the Prime Minister, eventually even approved by the Queen, will there still be systematic checks and balances possible when a decision is already being made by the Prime Minister? How much of a so-called system procedure do we still have in order to take back some of the inappropriate decisions, if they were?
Yeah, well, the UK system is of course different from others in lots of ways, and one of those, to use an example already noted, say comparing the UK with the United States. The United States has got three branches of government that hold each other in a checks and balance system, often a bit adversarial, and things move very slowly. In the UK, you don't have anything like that in the unwritten constitution. What makes things, I think, very kind of different or difficult at the present moment constitutionally is you've got the Prime Minister making a request to the Queen to do something that is fairly unprecedented. Not necessarily suspending Parliament, that happens before a Queen's speech quite routinely, but to do so for so long, and to do so with the purposes not of genuinely preparing a new agenda, but it would seem genuinely, according to ministers recorded by the media and released on social media, to enable Brexit to happen by default, silencing MPs, denying them the ability to act in our parliamentary democracy in our Parliament. That's unprecedented. Now, while the Queen, acting non-politically, did probably the right thing in following the advice of her minister, of her Prime Minister, it would be pouring gasoline on the fires of constitutional outrage if it were to be found, and it's being heard in the court next week, whether the Prime Minister gave a request that was unlawful to Her Majesty in requesting a suspension of Parliament. While it might not be likely to succeed, if it were, we would really be in a new situation altogether. And I think it is possible that this challenge could succeed, where the Queen will have acted on the advice of the Minister and done so unlawfully.
I see. Mr. White, also to your expertise, in 1.3 million, that's what we're reading from press reports about so-called anti-suspension petition signing already going on inside the UK. People expect that number to increase as well. Now, to what threshold will that be a challenge to the decision? Will it be?
Well, of course, there is no formal role for such petitions, for such signatures within the British system. So directly, the effect is pretty minimal. Indirectly, of course, it strengthens it increases the value of dissent among the Conservative members who disagree with the line that Mr. Johnson is taking. It strengthens the hand of those who want to block his plans, and his plans appear to be to leave the European Union without a deal on the 31st of October. and it makes those people who oppose him feel that they've got greater political support. At the same time, of course, his move to suspend Parliament it may have strengthened their will, but it has weakened their means. It makes it more difficult for them to do that.
Mr. Cui, you've been attentively listening to your colleagues coming from different parts of Europe talking about it. Of course, China has no say at all in the decision or not decision made in the UK, but it certainly is one of those very interesting examples to see the governance style of today's world. Your observation of what's going on, particularly what is the nature of this leading up to the styles of leadership we are seeing today?
Indeed, as an observer, especially far from London, I think we need to also keep a very close concern, because not only I think China will not just stay outside, because we do have a bigger interest, and we should have a big concern what's the real or what's the final result of the Brexit. But indeed, I think we can find now, especially from the case of the Brexit or some recent, progress. I think now for UK or for some other Western countries, clearly now it's a time for we define so-called democracy, and how could they keep a balance between the democracy and the maybe efficient governance. So I think now it's a very useful case from Brexit, from Madam May to the Mr. Johnson, and we can find that maybe the same gaming between the government and the parliament, but with a different context, with a different mindset, approaches. So I think now it's good time for us to understand really now how British people, how British politicians, they try to find out a new area or maybe new possibility for the political system, especially in the name of the mother of a parliament. But very ridiculous now is where is the role of a parliament?
Which is important, I guess, according at least to the system. Now, Mr. White, we understand that after the referendum, some in the UK actually regretting the result. They would rather go back to for a second referendum about whether Brexit or not, even the decision itself. And then the decision makers, whether it's in the parliament or in the executive branch, seem to suggest, well, we have no way to turn back. And Mr. Johnson was elected into the office as a result of his political stance. But if one part of the system could be further exploited, shall I say, explored and exploited, will people also ask the other part of the system should be further explored or exploited as well? Will there be more options coming up as a result of the recent debate of Parliament vis-à-vis executive branch?
We're in very interesting times, Tianwei, and I think 6 months ago I would not have expected that we would still be here discussing this. And the reason that we're still here discussing this is precisely because the Parliament took control of the process at the start of the year and forced the government. And don't forget, the government 6 months ago was determined to leave the European Union with or without a deal on the 29th of March. And that's 5 months ago now. So we're at the stage where all kinds of things that had not been seen as possible before are being exploited. And Boris Johnson, the Prime Minister, is essentially risking, he is betting, that his opponents will not be able to get their act together as quickly as he is, and that he will be able to think more quickly than Mrs. May was able to do at the start of the year. It's very difficult to tell which side is going to prevail at this point. As in most countries, as indeed in China, the government, of course, does have the biggest influence on how legislation plays out, what the course of the country will be. But as in any country, the government is not the only voice. Not the only hand on the lever, not the only people who have some part of control in this. And we're seeing a debate about how the British system works of the kind that we really haven't seen for a very long time.
this is not a time to criticize any system or to praise any system, but rather a curious time to see the changes of the systems and also the ways of governance, and to see what it means for all of us moving forward, as you rightly put, Mr. White. Professor Begg, I want to come back to you as well. Now, with all of these options now becoming all possible, it seems, if there is a way to do it within the system, do you see the country will be more likely to come to consensus with efficiency, or the country will be more divided with efficiency?
I think the country is divided. That's unambiguous. And what's happened is that over the last few months, particularly towards the end of Theresa May's period in power, there was a process of kicking the can down the road, not coming to the decision on Brexit and exactly how it was going to happen. Now, you know me, I'm not particularly a supporter of Boris Johnson, but what he has done is to bring this to the point where he's brought this to the point where a decision has to be made, and where further kicking of the can down the road is not going to be possible. And you could even say that what he's done this week in proroguing Parliament is a way of ensuring that there is no further delay in this. And that puts the onus on those who are opposed to his approach to come together, as we've seen them doing this week, to come up with an alternative solution. So rather than saying what they're against, they now have to say what they are for. And that's the fundamental change we're witnessing in the shenanigans of this week.
Extremely interesting. Twists and turns. Mr. Cui, now, will there be a kind of change? Maybe that's what people outside the UK are all thinking about, including those inside the country. But what would that mean for all of us here in this part of the world? Your analysis, sir.
I think, yes, we
I know you can answer the question within for as long as 1 day's time, but you have to answer that within 40 seconds if you can, sir.
Sure. Now we also need to maybe find some focuses related to this issue.
Yeah.
I think, of course, the very important issue is, I think also we can share some thinking with our counterparts in Europe and also in UK, is how could we find out a better way of governance, and how could we to find the way to deal with some challenges from the huge changes, especially in the relations between the government and the society, and between the public opinion and the opinion from the elite. And another very big issue is how could we find out some the real effect from this Brexit on the other parts of the world.
Yes.
So I think that now for Mr. Johnson and his government, not only he should take responsibility for UK people, for British people, and also he should take care of any, spillover effect of the Brexit, especially his goal as a so-called hard Brexit on some other parts of the world.
Now, before we go, I have a final question for Professor Brooks. Now, earlier prime ministers having had some trouble about the Brexit issue, we see them gone within a short term of their prime ministership. Will this be the very beginning of Mr. Johnson, though elected during turbulent times into the office, of a very turbulent prime ministership to come?
I believe it will be a very turbulent time to come. It's difficult to see how short or long his reign might be. 3 years ago, in August 2016, I was on record saying that Brexit was not going to happen under Theresa May, and it wasn't because of some elite stitch-up or people not liking democracy. It's just that people were rushing towards doing something without thinking about how they were going to achieve it. And I don't see exactly what Boris Johnson's doing right now to genuinely achieve Brexit. He seems to be trying to scare the EU into, he's very serious about no deal, and he's going to try to suspend Parliament to help him achieve that, but without actually making any preparations for if no deal really did happen, without any genuine vision of what would happen post-Brexit if he did get some new deal with the EU, what would be different and better about the UK afterwards. So I think we got turbulent times to come. And also note that his Chief of Staff has been found in contempt of Parliament, his Attorney General refusing to abide by the rules of the Commons, also had the previous government found in contempt of Parliament. You have people who are going to be putting our Constitution under threat, and it's time for our parliamentarians to stand up for our Constitution and our rule of law.
I see. Before we go, I want to have the four of you to answer one general question very briefly for everyone. Before the suspension of the Parliament, from now until then, what should be some of the real things that we should monitor very closely to fill the real pulse? Mr. Begg, Professor.
Well, there are two games of poker going on. One between Boris and the European Union, and the second between Boris and the parliamentarians.
All right.
The obligation on the parliamentarians is to find a way of winning their poker hand.
Professor Brooks.
Some will be bluffing, some are not.
Okay. Professor Brooks.
I think the thing to look for next week is to see if there is some type of binding motion law stopping the government, or forcing them to request an extension on the Brexit date. I think that's the main thing, more so than a no confidence vote. I think the first has got more support than the latter. It'll be interesting to see what happens.
Mr. Cui.
There will be some response from Parliament and even from society, but I will keep a close concern what's the real purpose from Mr. Johnson, maybe a select election ahead.
Interesting. Mr. White, last but not least.
One thing we're not seeing at all, and that I don't think we will see, is senior British visitors to the building behind me, to the headquarters of the European Union. I don't think they're serious about negotiating, and the game is all about what's happening in Parliament.
Nicholas White, Thomas Brooks, Cui Hongjian, and Ian Begg. Thank you so much, gentlemen, helping us to understand the real stories behind the headlines. Really appreciate it. Thank you. Have a great weekend. You're watching World Insight with me, Tian Wei. Still to come on our live program. Trade tensions put a damper on Chinese looking to study in the U.S. The consequences of a throttled academic exchange. We will talk about that right after this break. Welcome back. You're still watching World Insight. I'm Tian Wei. The program coming to you live from Beijing. With the coming semester, there are many Chinese students going abroad to study. For a long time, the United States has been the most popular destination for them. But geopolitics is now getting in the way as the new administration in the United States steps up restrictions on Chinese businesses and academic exchanges between China and the United States as part of its broader trade war. So how exactly does the China-U.S. trade war affect the prospects of Chinese students to study in the U.S.? Before our discussion, take a look at this background.
More than 360,000 Chinese students enrolled at American colleges in the 2017-18 academic year, up from just 100,000 a decade ago. These students and the universities that host them now find themselves in the crossfire of the U.S. trade war with China. Since last year, Washington has tightened visa rules and intensified scrutiny on research collaborations between the two countries. At the same time, allegations of spying and intellectual property theft leveled by the administration against Chinese students and researchers have contributed to a hostile environment that threatens to undo years of progress. U.S. universities have tried to distance themselves from the administration's hostility. Some, including the University of California, Berkeley, Yale University, and New York University, have sent open letters to students offering support and assistance. Even so, the atmosphere adds a new level of anxiety for students and researchers. The educational exchange between China and the United States has strained many talents in the past decades. Many have made great contributions after returning to China, Chen Qiusan and Deng Chashan, to name a few. Should the free flow of knowledge, ideas, and learners be held hostage with the trade war?
So how do geopolitical tensions affect the Chinese students studying abroad, particularly inside the United States? In our Beijing studio, we have two joining us. Professor David Bartosch from the U.S. originally. Now he's teaching at Germany, okay, Beijing Foreign Studies University. Also, Wang Yan, Director of the Department for International Exchange at the National Institution for National Sciences, for Education Sciences of China. Joining us in our Beijing GMY studio, Roxy Wang, founder of Xinxiang Education Consulting. She's been advising Chinese students to go abroad to study. Welcome to the three of you, ladies and gentlemen. Now, coming from China, Ms. Wang, you've been helping students try to go to the United States, but have you seen some changes of interest over the past few years in terms of their preference and of destinations? Roxy?
Yes. Oh, sorry. Yeah, so I've definitely witnessed some changes over the past years, and in terms of the influence of the policy, I think it's both yes and no on the influence of the students. So yes, in terms of, you know, students, the policy changes on visa rejection and on the other side of the U.S., but also no, because I've seen actually a lot of increase over the interest in students going studying abroad. So for example, a very sad example from last year was that I have a student who got into a biology graduate program at Johns Hopkins University. You know, she's extremely excellent and she's very outstanding, and she got admitted. But at last, she was actually rejected at the visa part. So I think from that sense is that we could feel like a lot of students are still trying to study abroad and receiving education, but unfortunately this part will probably still pose some kind of concerns for parents and students and give them second thoughts in terms of going abroad.
When you are talking about going abroad, do you mean the United States, or do you mean abroad generally?
Right. So, so I was in that case, I was more talking about studying abroad in the U.S. So, in terms of the total number of students going abroad, has actually been increasing over years, and we could witness that. So last year we had over 500,000 students going abroad, and this year it's been increased over to 600,000. And among all of them, we have about 390,000 going to the U.S. But there are some concerns. We've witnessed, you know, certain drop in numbers in terms of students that are enrolled in the U.S.-oriented course curriculum in certain international branches of schools. But I think that's probably just for the short term as of now because of these policies and changes to rules.
Yeah, whether it's for the short term or not, let's take a look at some of the numbers we have got hold. According to a report published by the Institute of International Education, for the first time in a decade, new foreign students enrollment in American schools declined for 2 years in a row. By contrast, in the UK, however, which is also another important destination for international students, according to HESA, new international enrollment in British higher education institutions increased by 5%. Now, we are not saying, Ms. Wang, of course, all these numbers contribute as a result of the geopolitical situation going on between China and the United States or other political changes, but certainly this is quite a number to look at. Ms. Wang, what's your understanding of the impact of China-U.S. trade war, whether it's on the attitude, the mentality, feelings of students going to study or willing to study in the U.S.?
So
let me go to Ms. Wang here in Beijing studio, in studio with me. I'll address both of you with your, I guess, the first name so that we know each other. Okay, go ahead. Yeah.
Yeah. First, I think it's impact the visa policy, because if some students, especially those apply for the high-tech related programs, could not get a visa, this probably will impact the other students' applications to study in the United States, especially if that's their preferred or expected choice of the program. And then second is the current trade war actually will have impact not only on the mentality or attitude towards their choice of their preferred destination, because this will be associated with their expectation towards their future prospects in the destination country. For example, if they could be admitted into an ideal program, and if they could get a job even on temporary terms after graduation. And also this will involve a lot more uncertainties. So this will definitely affect their decision, the choice of the destination, if it's United States or other countries.
I see. If you look at what the American academic community has been saying over the past year, there has also been increasing concern about whether the impact of the trade war is having on the quality of students going to America and the way the students are being received in America from China. For example, in June this year, every student, faculty, and staff at the Massachusetts Institute of Technology, or MIT, received an email from their president. In the public lecture, President said, who is also an immigrant from Venezuela himself, he was heartbroken to hear students tell him that he feels unfairly scrutinized, stigmatized, and on edge just for being Chinese ethnicity. He said that he takes national security risks of academic espionage very seriously, but he also said that we, according to him, take great care not to create a toxic atmosphere of unfounded suspicion and fear. By paying tribute to MIT alumni I.M. Pei, he also argued that in a nation like ours, that's what the president of the MIT said, immigration is a kind of oxygen, each fresh wave re-energizing the body as a whole. If we have part of the letter, it would be wonderful to show to our audience over there. But let me come back to you, Professor Bartosz. You corrected me at the very beginning from Germany. So would this mean great and golden opportunity for European educational institutions to have better quality of your students coming from China?
Yes, of course. And I mean, it is a big disadvantage for the US. I mean, it's a very wrong development, but it's not a disadvantage for the Chinese students because they can choose where to go and they can choose where to develop and where to bring their excellency to fruition. And I would very much invite Chinese students also to Germany because we don't have student fees or very low student fees. You can study in English as well. If you want to study engineering or natural science, you can study in English, or you can study the great philosophers, the German. And you have to think about, I mean, the US is also very much lived on people also coming from Europe to work in US academic science institutions, and many of the Nobel Prize winners came from Europe. So you can also study where these Nobel Prize winners have studied originally. So
you're already become an ambassador for educational institutions inside Germany.
That's what comes to my mind, because I think this whole development is, I cannot understand how these decisions are made, because they are for the disadvantage of the US, but not for the disadvantage of any Chinese students in the long run. Of course, for these poor students who are in this terrible situation at the moment, it's not a good thing to, but those who are yet in the decision process, I think, why not? And I think it's also part of a larger development. I mean, we are also, when we think about studying abroad, as we just saw, many people think it's just the US, right? But we are more and more living in a multipolar environment. So there are Chinese students going to Russia to study in Russia. There are Chinese students going to Italy, to Germany, to Sweden, wherever.
To Japan.
To Japan, sorry. Yeah, Japan. I forgot Japan.
Mm.
Japan is very important, to Australia. So many possible destinations, and also more languages. I think one of the reasons for the fixation is at the moment is that the English language is the most the language which is dominant at the moment. But I think you can also study in English in other countries.
That's true.
Why not also studying a second
We
foreign language?
heard your argument. You know, for those students that are studying in the U.S. campuses, a lot of them fear there will be unfounded scrutinization as a result of the trade war or increasing tension between China and the United States. From every one of you, is there any advice, if you can, 30 seconds, we're running out of time. Roxy, you go first.
So there is any advantage of this
advice, rather.
All right, so I think in terms of all these recent changes and all these disturbances that we've seen over students, I actually do think that it's actually a good pressure that I've seen over students. So the biggest difference that I've witnessed between students back in my time about 10 years ago versus students now is that students now are they're working extremely much harder than before in order to get into really good schools. I mean, I work with students who want to go to top 30 or even go to the top 10 students, and they're trying to really improve themselves all the way around. So I think that would probably be something that that's great actually about the students in the future.
Work harder. That's your advice, it seems. Professor Bartosz, 30 seconds.
Be open, embrace this new world situation, be flexible, also be keen maybe to learn another foreign language, be open to Europe, as I said, also
more
Japan or other countries, because that's definitely the future, and also the future where China is headed. And last thing, also we should think about how to make use of the talents who have studied abroad, and how to implement these students back in China, or how to create a new network of excellence.
It should happen on different layers, right?
Different layers.
Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah.
The current visa policy, I believe, is probably against the will of many individual universities and also many individuals in the United States. So it really depends on who the students is studying, which universities are studying with. So if they could still stay, and then stay. If not, China will welcome them back, and also the Germany will come to study there. This just opened up the door to another new world,
new
and broader
yes,
horizons. Another wonderful part of life experience.
Wow, very interesting. As you said, embrace the reality, because they are the realities, and we live in reality. And no complaint, because that's probably going to bring us more options. Thank you so much, Wang Yan, Roxy Wang, last but not least, David Bartosz. Really appreciate it. Thank you.
Thank you very much.
That is all the time we have for today. If you'd like to see more, try to find us World Insight CGT Engineer search engine. Check out our YouTube channel. Follow us on Twitter, Facebook, and Sina Weibo. From me, Tian Wei, and everyone on the World Insight team. Thanks for watching. Tune in again next time for more insights across China and around the world. The weekend is here, so go chill and have a great one. Good night.